A car that's got just 30,000 miles on it should be pretty darn close to mint, right? Right? Well, if it's a Jeep, wrong. This is my 2003 Jeep Wrangler Sahara I purchased from the original owner with just 30,000 miles on it. But it's from Maine, where vehicles turn to dust, essentially. I knew the frame needed some attention, but it had some horrid hidden damage. And so, I've decided to take on my largest project ever and travel 200 miles to Vermont to buy a new, used frame. We've stripped, cleaned, and painted the new frame, changed diff fluids, and installed new shocks on it, and stripped the interior from the Jeep body to lighten it up for its removal from the frame. I've pulled the radiator, I've pulled the battery, and a few other small things that needed to come off, and that's what we're going to be continuing with today, disconnecting everything that connects from the body of the Jeep to the frame and to the engine. And then, I don't think it'll be by today, but by either tomorrow or the end of the week, we'll lift the body up off of the frame. And I still don't know how we're gonna do that. But for now, we still got plenty to disconnect, starting with the steering. Because on our new frame, the steering shaft, we have everything all the way up to here. So on the Jeep itself, in order to be able to pull the tub right off, I believe it's, let's see if I can get you guys an angle. I believe it's this joint here that we're gonna wanna remove so that the tub can go off. So out comes the bolt that clamps the shaft to the splines, and then the steering shaft just slides back off. Surprisingly easy. And as Dad removes the brake lines from the master cylinder, I unplug the two harnesses that go from the ECU to the body of the Jeep. And with both those out, I can start on pulling the auto transmission cross member, which leads us to a very, very sucky part of this build. I've been stuck on the transfer case linkage. The automatic transmission linkage did come off. The transfer case linkage is being a bit more difficult. And unfortunately, even though it's a Jeep and usually pretty easy to work on, there's not a whole lot of room up there, especially with this little number in the way. I think we're gonna have to do something I really don't want to do, and that's remove. Yeah, I'll come down and show you. Let's remove this thing. The transmission, geez, there's too many remove the transmission skid plate, which is also the mount. The problem is, the bolts, 3 on each side, they're all easily accessible, but the nut or nutsert that's up in the frame, when I go to loosen this bolt, I can guarantee you it's gonna spin. They always do, all of them, they'll spin right in the frame. Then you have to cut the bolt, get the nutsert out, put a new nutsert in. It's just a pain. So let's see if they come out. All right, see how this goes. Oh, no way that came out. Or it was coming out, that's good. 1 out of 6, fail. If you listen closely, you can actually hear the nut in the frame spinning in the sand and crap that's all up in there. Number 2. It's definitely spinning. Good. Number 2. Let's see about this one. It's spinning. I think it's spinning in the frame. And this is all welded to the frame, to the skid plate. That's good. This is gonna just be a sucky job. Being discouraged with my failure on the driver's side of the skid plate, I decided to try my luck on the 4 small nuts that hold the tranny mount to the skid plate. Maybe these ones aren't as rusted. I surely hope so. I'll spray them with some PV Blaster and hit them with a torch to hopefully loosen up any rust. I'm not worried about hurting the rubber mount with heat, because I'll be replacing that mount anyways. But lo and behold, out comes Mr. Sawzall to cut the nuts right off. That sounds painful, but with them finally off, I unfortunately had to move back to the larger skid plate bolts, where we made a crappy discovery. Looks like they welded this patch panel to the transmission skid plate. So now, instead of just cutting the heads off the large skid plate bolts, we also have to grind all the welds attaching the skid plate to the frame, which, no, is not something they did at the factory. Now I can start cutting the heads off the 3 skid plate bolts and grinding away the welds holding the skid plate to the frame. It sucks that all this has to be done just to access the transfer case linkage. Now that one side of the skid is free, I'll put a jack under the transmission to support it so I can start removing the bolts on the other side. I'll give each of them the benefit of the doubt and try with a ratchet first, before calling myself an idiot and just cutting them off. What a shocker! Absolutely none of them came out, and they all get to be cut off. I put another jack under the skid so it doesn't just come crashing down and potentially yank on the transmission, before battering the last bolt with a hammer to finally free the skid. But one more little piece of the welder's repair needed to get cut off before the skid can finally come out. All right, and here it is. Wow. And look at this frame. My gosh. This thing's in rough shape. We'll decide later if we're gonna repair or replace this. But the frame, it's destroyed. Way worse than I thought. But what's even worse is what we have to do next. So now it's time for arguably the hardest part of this entire project, or potentially can turn into the hardest part of this entire project. And that's removing the 11 body mount bolts. They're 11 long bolts like this. They go up through the frame, through a rubber bushing, into a nut that's welded inside of the body of the Jeep. But those nuts, just like the nuts that are welded inside the frame that we had to cut the bolts out of, the ones that hold the skid plate up, they either like to just spin up there when they get rusted, or else the bolt won't come out and they'll just snap. And if that happens, no. We'd have to cut open the floor, take the nut out, somehow get it out, weld in a new one, re-weld the floor. No, not happening. This was something I was seriously dreading with this project. With how rusted everything's been so far, this is set to be a nightmare. So, for the 3 weeks leading up to this, I've been spraying or trying to spray all the bolts and the nuts with PB Blaster. Now, it's hard to kind of get to them. There's not really any easy way, especially the nuts, because they're welded up into the tub. And some people actually said to drill a hole so that you can spray PB Blaster onto those nuts to loosen them up, because it can be such a crapshoot if those things start to spin up there. I am really not looking forward to this. But the day finally came, where I must sack up and just go for it. Well, Steve and I, of course. Steve brought over a special tool called an induction heater. It can heat the bolts red hot without heating and potentially damaging everything around the bolt, like you would using a regular torch, like I usually do. But would it heat it enough to break the rust? Holy it worked!
So you put it on it, squeeze it, let it heat it a little bit. Then when you put the gun on it, just kind of like, just by squeezing the trigger, you'll know.
2 are out so far. Only 9 left to do.
Wow.
But would we be so lucky? Slowly but surely, one by one, the bolts were coming out. Down to the last 2, but these are in a spot that's got the worst rust around them. But finally, incredibly, the last one's out. I cannot freaking believe that all 11 of the body mounts came out. I am in absolute awe. I was dreading this moment. This is incredible. Now I just have to cut the transfer case bracket off because I can't get it off, and I'll just replace it when I go to rebuild the Jeep. I'm so relieved. Out comes the Sawzall once again to get the side steps off and out of the way, so we can plan how we're gonna get this body up off the frame.
A long one here somehow. I just want to go up with it, and then if you get up a little bit, put a 2x4 into here. You'll be a little higher.
Dad and I disconnected a few last things before we start the frankly daunting and not by the book, unconventional way of lifting the body up off the frame. Let's see how this goes. My dad and I have done a lot of projects together over the years, but removing the body of a car off its frame, this is a first. And I don't have a lift, so we're gonna do this a slightly different way. Using dunnage, a Harbor Freight floor jack, and some 2x4s. And no, that wasn't a joke. We'll lift the body slightly.
Okay, now what we gotta do is put 2x4 or something under there and see if we can let it down.
Make
a little.
those like spacers.
And put small blocks of 2x4s in between the body and the bushing. Imagine like a body bushing made of wood, and taller. We'll remove the rubber bushings themselves and start with just one block of 2x4 replacing it, and build all the way up till we're high enough to clear everything and to roll the frame out from under. To lighten up the body as much as possible, as you guys saw in the last part of this Jeep build, we removed all the seats from the Jeep. But to lighten it even more, we're going to take off another sizable piece of weight on the tub.
Ready?
The roof. 6 Allen screws later, the top lifts off. Dad starts to let some air out of the tires so the frame sits lower to the ground, and then I remove the gas filler neck since that's staying attached to the gas tank that's staying in the frame. And slowly but surely, I keep jacking it up.
Definitely going up.
Dad checks if we're getting hung up on anything, and we add more 2x4 blocks between the frame and the body. And it was incredible to see. This irregular way of lifting the body off was actually working. We were making progress.
We're actually pretty high up now.
Yeah, look at the front. Look at these bumps.
Holy crap.
And we just keep adding and adding more 2x4s to get more lift height. We're really getting some altitude with this thing now, but we're still just not high enough to get the chassis out. The higher we go, the more blocks we can add between the body and the frame, jacking one side up, then the other, until we're tall enough to slide a 2x6 plank under the tub for it to sit on. And as the body goes airborne, we can see and disconnect a few final things before it's entirely free, like the ground wire, alternator cable, and power wire to the starter. And I think that was the last actual thing that needed to become disconnected. That was the harness that goes to the fuse box here. That's all laying free now. Everything's disconnected. AC line's disconnected, computer's disconnected from the body harness. I think that's everything. It's crazy looking at this thing. Look at, it's a lot of progress for a day. This is really, really cool though. A few more blocks were needed to get the tub sat at the height we needed to clear the frame as we rolled it out. So the 7.3 and I loaded up. And as Dad kept building up the height of the tub, I disconnected a few evap lines near the gas tank now that I had the clearance to do so. We made another block tower with another 2x6 plank and sat them far enough widthwise so the frame can come out without the tires running into them. I'm at a jack. Holy frick.
So we're going to have to end up, we're going to have to just shim this up here now quick, lower that jack, put that jack inside so it can move.
Okay.
We got to move, well, yeah, and then we're going to have to jack it up quick and slide this over more.
Okay, yeah.
This wants to be somewhat centered, so.
We cleared all the wood out of the way that we didn't need, so we had a clear shot to pull this frame out from under the tub with zero obstructions. Then let all the air out of the tires to just get that little itty bit of clearance we needed so the frame could come out. That was just what we needed. Watch how the motor, the highest point we have to clear, drops to just below the grill. But in the midst of all the chaos, I almost made a very big mistake. That was close. I forgot these AC lines that go up there, so we're still connected up there, and as we were lifting the tub, it was pulling on these, so I don't think we damaged anything yet. So I followed these down to here, pull these out, and keep going up with the tub. After correcting my almost very costly mistake, we removed the back tires to gain that little more clearance we needed. We'll roll the frame out while it's on the jack. At least that's the plan.
You're gonna clear? All we gotta do is the motor's gotta clear that radiator up front.
I mean, I think we're gonna just barely clear. Now the side support jacks can come out, meaning the whole Jeep is now supported on just the 2x6 planks. Dad rolled the new frame out of the way, and we cleared a path to make room for the tool we're gonna use to slide the old frame from under the body. My '99 Wrangler, of course. What better way to disassemble a Jeep than to use another? We'll use a short strap to loop around the front cross member of the frame and attach it to the front shackle on the other Jeep. And then, very slowly, at the expense of my poor clutch, start to pull back on the chassis. If I yank too hard and something gets caught up on the Jeep body, then it'll come crashing down off the planks and ruin this whole project, and all this would have been for nothing. We've both got to be on our A game here. I can't back up too quick, and he's got to watch every little dangling piece from the Jeep body. Now that the highest point on the rolling chassis, the top of the engine, was clear of the lowest point on the Jeep body, the bottom of the grille, Dad can jump to the back to make sure nothing gets snagged up back there. So far, so smooth. The jack is supporting the rear end of the Jeep and rolling it out as intended, but we're just not out of the woods yet. So we can go a little further. He drops the jack down a tiny bit more to make absolute sure we're clear of everything. And then we keep inching away at it, and we're almost there. And finally, what felt like days later, the old rusted frame and the body of the Jeep are no longer one, beginning the start of this Wrangler's new life.
Oh my God.
What an incredible thing to see. And what a mess. But there's no time to celebrate yet, and Dad makes sure of it. So back on go the wheels and tires. Dad fills them back up with air, and the next piece of the puzzle begins. Getting this engine, transmission, and transfer case out of the old frame, or what's left of it. This thing's in bad shape, especially now that I've been hammering on it. All right, that was quite a bit of work yesterday. But the frame and the tub are now separate. How crazy is this? Look at how high up it is. I'm not a short person, and this Jeep was not a tall thing. But we have a lot of work to do on it before we swap everything over. I'm gonna tape everything up. I've actually already started. I'm gonna pressure wash this whole thing, clean it, degrease it. I've got to pull the axles. We're gonna start with pressure washing this, number one, but we have to roll it into the street. This engine and trans are in need of some serious cosmetic care before we remove it from the frame. So to start, I'm gonna tape off everything important and electrical so I can pressure wash. Then to give the chassis some exercise, since it hasn't moved in a bit, I'll take it for a nice stroll around the block. I'll soak the engine and trans with gunk degreaser, link down below to it, which is pretty potent stuff, making sure to get it into all the nooks and crannies. I then came to the unfortunate realization that to spare the driveway, I should get the frame into the street to wash it off. So I got my second workout of the day, dragging the frame into the road. You think your neighbors are weird? Imagine driving by a man pulling a car with no body on it through their yard. After navigating the chassis to its designated position on the side of the road, I gave it a rinse with the pressure washer. Then gunked it with degreaser once again, and sprayed it off one final time to make sure this thing is clean as a whistle. And while it may be clean, it's still looking pretty darn ugly. It's gonna need a freshening up. So I dry out the nooks and crannies with the blowgun and bring out our old pal, the needle scaler, to touch up a few areas. While it's drying, I'm gonna start on removing the exhaust. The clamp comes off nice and easy, but the nuts on the flange are unrecognizable. So we call in our friend Mr. Sawzall for that one. That muffler's got a hole in it anyways, so we're gonna be replacing it. Both the clamps holding this piece of pipe are off, but this thing isn't budging. I'm shocked. So it's getting sliced. I'll work on getting the two pieces of the collar off the other pipes later. But now the exhaust is out, and the motor's now dry, so we can start to lay down some paint. I'm gonna brush it on since it'll go on thicker and get into the little crevices better. Plus, I won't have to worry about overspray. I'm using good old Rust-Oleum Rusty Metal Primer, cause that's what I had. And it got really good reviews on some agriculture forums as an engine paint. I like the way it goes on too. Call me Bob Ross the way I be painting happy little trees on this Jeep motor. That stuff does take quite a while to dry though. 24 hours is recommended, and people say it takes longer than that. So the next morning, I'm going to start to pull the drive shafts, because those are going to need to be removed to lift the engine, trans, and transfer case out of the chassis. I'll remove the 4 bolts holding the shaft to the yoke on the rear diff, then pull it from the yoke, remove the clamp holding on the rubber boot, and the shaft just slides out. The front's a tad different, and a tad more rusted. So I need the torch to heat up the bolts. Then I can remove the 4 bolts holding the transfer case yoke to the double cardan joint on the rear of the front drive shaft. And then onto the front where there's another 4 bolts that holds the straps on the U-joint onto the yoke on the front differential. Then with a pry bar and some curious sounding grunts, the front comes out. And then out comes the back.
And there's number 2.
I'm going to replace the U-joints on the drive shafts before I put them into the new frame. All 5 of them. And that starts by chiseling out all the snap rings, most of which do not fully come out and just break in there. These drive shafts look a little, shall we say, crusty. So before we install the new U-joints in them, let's hit them with some paint. But first is the prep. A wire wheel on the grinder is perfect for flinging rust chips at me at high speed and getting these shafts silky smooth. I'll hit the catalytic converter too. That's going to need paint as well. Then rinse everything down and scrub it with some Dawn soap. These things are looking great, but it'll look even better with some fresh paint. So again, riding the Rust-Oleum train, I'm doing 2 coats of Rusty Metal Primer, this time from the spray can, then 2 coats of their filler primer, to hopefully fill a little of those dimples from the corrosion and give us a more level surface. Then the catalytic converter gets sprayed with a VHT high temp silver, and the drive shafts get Rust-Oleum flat black. Now that it's been over 24 hours, the engine's ready for its top coat. Rust-Oleum flat black is what I'm going to brush on now, which would end up being a total waste of time. So I spend an hour painting the whole engine flat black, and now a few days later, I'm redoing it in gloss black. Because I'm an idiot. I decided gloss black would look more factory. But it actually looks pretty good if I don't say so myself. I think I've found my calling. Not. All right, now today's a pretty big portion, a pretty big part of the project. Because what we need to do, now that the tub is all up in the air by itself, is we have to clean up all of this area up here. All this scaling and stuff, all this rust, especially here. This is the fender, and I don't know what I'm gonna do about this. It could almost stand to have a new fender put on it, but I really, really don't want to have to do that. Not that it's difficult, it just, this is all original. If the fitment changes and stuff, the paint's different, all that. But what we're gonna do, we'll focus on that after. What we're gonna do now is clean up all of this. So we're gonna remove this heat shield, clean up both the frame rails, or not the frame rails, the tub rails, and get all of this down here ready for paint. Areas like this, we'll find, we'll see if we're gonna replace that or fix it. But basically we're stripping all this down, see what we need to repair, and then get what doesn't need to be fixed all ready for paint. It's gonna be a long day of grinding, sanding, and rust in the eyes. Let's go. There's a decent amount of surface scaling down here, and I'm sure once we start poking around, it'll be holes, not surface scaling. Regardless, it's getting a transformation. So we'll start by removing the inner fender liners before giving everything a quick blow off with the compressor to knock off any light stuff loose. Then break out the wire wheel and grinder and go to town, starting on the transmission tunnel and driver's side floor and using the needle scaler to break up the hard stuff. Then onto the underside of the driver and passenger side fenders, switching back and forth between the grinder with the wire wheel and the needle scaler for the tough corners the wire wheel can't reach. Then onto the back area where the rear seat would be, where I was finally smart enough to put on a hood to keep from coating my hair with rust chips. I'm sure the shower tonight is still going to be disgusting. Not gonna lie, this is a bit laborious, especially without a lift and being on the ground. But, as my dad always says, you just gotta do what you gotta do. Thanks, Dad. But the progress does a good job at inspiring you to keep going, to keep pushing. Here's what it looked like before, and here's after. Not too bad for something that no one's ever gonna see again. It's gonna look even better when painted. But I keep chipping away, literally, up around the transmission tunnel and finishing up with the rear wheel wells. And it actually looks pretty crappy. But that'll change with some paint. I'll start with some Rust-Oleum self-etching primer on the bare metal spots, and then coat the rest with some, again, brush-on rusty metal primer. Getting some nice thick paint on there to really protect under here. A process that took a long time. Several hours later, everything's coated. All right, now I've left the primer to dry for a few days. The weather also wasn't that fantastic. It was kind of raining. But the primer's been drying, and it supposedly takes a while to dry, especially if you brush it on. So it's been like 5 days. It's been like 5 days or something, and people said it could take even longer than that. I don't believe that. But it's time that we top coat the areas that we're able to prime, so that we'll top coat today, wait a few days for the top coat to dry, and then shuffle the boards around so that we can then work on the parts that the boards were covering. So I'm gonna basically just do all the areas that I can get that I already hit with the rusty metal primer, which by the way is looking really nice, with the exception of some areas. And I'm going to be top coating it with good old Rust-Oleum again. This isn't primer, this is just a, it's called Coastal Gray. I couldn't really find out what Chrysler coated the bottom of these tubs with from the factory. Mine was like a grayish, it was like a gray with overspray. A lot of the ones that I saw in Bring a Trailer that had really low miles, those were also like a grayish color. I could just do it black, it would look fine, but I'm trying to do a restoration, factory correct restoration. So I'm gonna do gray. It's Rust-Oleum. It won't fight with the Rust-Oleum primer that I used. And again, I've used Rust-Oleum for a while and have really good luck with it. It holds up well. It looks really good. And another bonus, it's relatively inexpensive, really inexpensive. To prep for the top coat of Rust-Oleum, I'll scuff it all down with a Scotch pad and tape off everything that won't be gray. Now we can spray. This is a lot quicker than brushing the paint, that's for sure. And after doing 2 coats to the transmission tunnel, floor pans, and the rear section, it's complete. And it's looking not too shabby. So you'll probably notice that I primed those fenders, but I never ended up top coating them. And that's because I want to address the corrosion and the rust at the bottom first before I paint. I didn't want to paint the tops of the insides of the fenders, be cutting and welding and heating up that paint, potentially ruining it. So I just want to address that first, get that fixed, and then I'll paint the whole underside of the fenders as one. But that'll be in the next video, along with pulling the engine transfer case and transmission out of the old frame, getting that into the new frame. There's going to be a couple hiccups with that, I'm sure. Then we'll finish swapping everything else over into the new frame. Then we'll be dropping the body onto the new frame. And I've got a pretty creative way that I'm going to be doing that. So you guys will definitely not want to miss the next Jeep build video. But that's it for today. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Happy motoring.